I first noticed it when old Mrs. Callahan stopped waving back. She lived 3 doors down from me, a frail woman with a sharp tongue and a soft heart. Every evening since I moved to this small town 3 years ago, she sat on her porch, rocking back and forth in that creaking chair of hers, sipping sweet tea. She always waved, even on her bad days. Then one night, she didn't. She just sat there, stiff as a corpse, her mouth slightly open, her eyes dull and unfocused. I tried not to think about it. Maybe she was just tired. Maybe she didn't see me. But the next night was the same. And the next. She didn't move, didn't blink, didn't even react to the mosquitoes that buzzed around her face. I remember standing on the sidewalk, watching her for way too long, my stomach twisting into knots. Something was wrong. Then, the Bennetts started acting strange. They lived across the street, always outside, always laughing. Young, happy, newly married. But one evening, I saw them standing on their lawn, barefoot in the dying sunlight, staring up at the sky. Not talking, not moving, just staring. I watched them for 5 whole minutes. Their heads were tilted at an unnatural angle, mouths slightly open, like they were waiting for something. Then, at the exact same time, they both turned toward me and smiled. Not a normal smile, a rotting one. Lips stretching too far, teeth bared, gums pale and dry. I rushed inside and locked my door. That's when the fear truly started to settle in. Because it wasn't just Mrs. Callahan. And it wasn't just the Bennetts. It was the whole damn town. I started noticing it everywhere. At the grocery store, Mr. Holman, the butcher, stood behind the counter, a bloodied cleaver in his hand. But he wasn't cutting. He wasn't doing anything. He just stood there, motionless, his head slowly tilting to one side like he couldn't hold it up anymore. His mouth was slack, a thin line of drool hanging from his bottom lip. When I called his name, he didn't react. At the diner, Maggie, the waitress, moved between tables, but she never took orders. Never blinked. She just placed empty plates down in front of empty seats, her motion sluggish and jerky, like a marionette on broken strings. No one else seemed to notice. Or maybe they couldn't. I tried to talk to my friend Jake about it. We met at the bar, the only spot in town that still felt halfway normal. At first, he laughed. "You need a break, man," he said, taking a sip of his beer. "Get out of town for a bit. You've been working too hard." But then I told him about Mrs. Callahan, about the Bennetts, about how the entire town was changing. Jake's face went pale. His fingers tightened around his glass. I noticed it too, he admitted. His voice was barely above a whisper. "My boss, Mr. Daniels? He hasn't spoken in days. Just stands in his office, staring at the wall. My neighbor, Henry, he walks in circles around his house for hours. But the worst part? He leaned in closer. My wife, he whispered. She's changing, too. That's when I saw it. His hands were shaking. His knuckles were white. She just stands at the foot of our bed at night," he continued. "Not sleeping, not blinking, just standing there, watching me. I try to talk to her, but she doesn't answer." I swallowed hard. My stomach was twisting in knots. "We need to leave," I said. "This town, it's not right anymore." Jake nodded, but we never got the chance. The next morning, I packed a bag, grabbed my keys, hauled ass to my truck. I drove straight for the highway, but no matter which road I took, I always ended up back in town. It didn't make sense. I tried again, different routes, different turns, and every single time, I found myself right back on my street, like something wouldn't let me leave. That night, I locked my doors, shut my blinds, sat in my living room, gripping a baseball bat with white-knuckled hands. Then the knocking started. Slow, steady, tap. I held my breath. It was almost midnight. Who the hell would be knocking at this hour? The sound came again. I forced myself to move. I crept toward the peephole, heart hammering, hesitated, then looked. It was Mrs. Callahan. Except, it wasn't. Her head was tilted too far to the side, like her neck was barely holding it up. Her mouth hung open, lips cracked and dry. Her eyes, lifeless and cloudy, stared straight ahead. She didn't blink, didn't move. Then, slowly, her hand rose. I stumbled backward. My breath hitched, and that's when she smiled. A slow, rotting grin. Something inside me snapped. I grabbed the nearest thing I could, a chair, a damn chair, and hurled it at the window. The glass shattered. Mrs. Callahan didn't react. She didn't even flinch. She just turned, slowly, stiffly, and walked away. The next day, my phone stopped working. The internet was down. The power flickered in and out. And the town? It wasn't even pretending to be normal anymore. People stood in the streets, staring at the sky. Others sat on their porches, unmoving, their bodies slumped in unnatural positions. And worst of all, they were watching me. No matter where I went, their heads turned in unison. Their blank, dead eyes followed me. Jake wasn't answering his phone. I tried going to his house, but when I knocked on the door, his wife answered. She stood there, her body motionless, her mouth slightly open. "Jake?" I asked. She didn't move, didn't blink. Then, in a slow, hoarse whisper, she said, "Jake is not here anymore." I ran. That night, I locked myself in my house. But they came, dozens of them, standing in my yard, staring. Their heads were tilted, their mouths slightly open. I could hear them breathing. Then, at the same time, they took one slow step forward, then another, and another, until they were pressed up against my windows. Their fingers tapped the glass, and then, they spoke, all of them, at the same time. Their voices, low, dry, rasping, whispered the same words. "Come outside. I don't know how much longer I can hold out, but if I open that door, I don't think I'll be me anymore."